Welcome back to our faith group series, Ripped from the Headlines, the chaos of Judges and the chaos of today. In these last couple of sessions, you're going to see that chaos intensifying and the character and actions of these so-called heroes become more and more questionable. But first, let's talk about promises. How many of you have ever crossed your heart, hope to die, make a promise, or maybe you shook on it, or you did a pinky swear? Think of all the promises that you have made. Think of all the promises that maybe you have broken. Promises are on rather shaky ground in our world today. From divorces to foreclosures, who can trust a promise? You've heard the old adage, how do you know when a politician is lying? When they're moving their lips. Promises these days seem to come with an expiration date, or at least an escape hatch. It's no wonder why we've grown skeptical and cynical and wary. Well, in our story from the book of Judges today, we meet a slick-talking promise maker. Actually, at first glance, he's movie subject material, a real rags to riches example and story. His name is Jephthah, which is a rather unfortunate name, I grant you that. And Judges 11 describes him as a Gileadite and a mighty warrior. Gilead was his father, but his mother, Judges notes, was a prostitute. As it turns out, the children of Gilead's actual wife, and those would be Jephthah's half-brothers and sisters, weren't too keen on sharing any potential inheritance with this child. So they kicked Jephthah to the curb. And our hero finds himself in Tob, where, interestingly, it says that worthless fellows collected around Jephthah and went out with him. Apparently, Jephthah's slick-talking ways were drawing a following of fellow outcasts around him. Well, years later, the Ammonites started attacking Israel. And the elders, including those from Gilead, need a hero. And they turn to none other than the very same man that they had cast out. They go to Jephthah and they beg him to come and lead him. To which Jephthah responds, "Dude, you kicked me to the curb." But they insisted. "Come, lead us," they beg. And not only that, they said, "Be the head over all the inhabitants of Gilead." They gave him full control and power. So Jephthah comes home, and he gets to work. The next section records a long conversation between the Ammonite king, and he charges Israel with occupying territory that was his. Well, Jephthah responds with a long rehearsal of Israel's history. He first points out that Israel won that area fair and square. You see, the king at that time wouldn't let the Israelites pass through, so Israel defeated him and occupied the land. Besides, Jephthah says, the larger point is that God gave them the land, all of Canaan. Well, then an interesting thing happens. Chapter 11, verse 29 says, "Then the Spirit of the Lord was upon Jephthah." Now, that the Spirit of the Lord would come upon a judge is not unusual, but what was unusual was the timing. You see, typically the Spirit comes upon the judge at the beginning. God chooses the judge in that way. In this account, however, the people pick Jephthah. Remember, they begged him to come and lead him. They pleaded for his leadership. Only now, on the brink of battle, does the Spirit come upon Jephthah, does God come into the picture, endorsing Jephthah by his Holy Spirit. And that should have been all that our newly anointed judge needed. That alone should have given Jephthah confidence for victory. Well, unfortunately, it didn't. Before heading to battle, Jephthah, who was gifted with words, who had been using words to build a following of outcasts, who used them to become leader over all the Gileadites, who had nearly used them to talk the king of the Ammonites into a truce, on this occasion, well, he should have kept his mouth shut. His fateful words are recorded in verses 30 and 31. And they came in the way of a hastily made vow, a terrible promise. Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, "If you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering." You've probably made some stupid promises yourself. Maybe it wasn't a deal with the devil, but it's likely that maybe at some point you said, "Lord, if you just make this happen, then I will," fill in the blank. Our Lutheran faith owes itself to one such hastily made promise. As a young law student, Martin Luther was walking along a road during a thunderstorm one day, and a bolt of lightning came so precariously close that Luther blurted out a vow to the patron saint of miners. "Saint Anne, save me, and I will become a monk," he promised. Well, he was saved, and he dropped out of law school and entered a monastery, and he changed the world. So that vow turned out pretty well. Others have not. The gospel tells a story of another hastily made vow that King Herod made. He had become so entranced by a dance performed by his niece/daughter, it's a little complicated, that Herod promised her whatever she wanted. Well, unfortunately, instead of a pony or a new iPhone, the little brat asked for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And King Herod was stuck honoring his vow. Well, we'll get to the results of Jephthah's vow, but first, we have a battle to fight. And the battle, for all of its buildup, is brief and one-sided. It only takes 2 verses to narrate it. So Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand. And he struck them from Aroer to the neighborhood of Minnith, 20 cities, as far as Abel-Keramim, and a great blow. So the Ammonites were subdued before the people of Israel. So Jephthah is victorious. Israel has been delivered, and they live happily ever after. Well, until Jephthah gets home, that is. Until there's a vow to be reckoned with. Verse 34 recounts what happens next. Then Jephthah came to his home in Mizpah, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and with dances. She was his only child. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. His daughter, his one and only child, comes bursting out of the house, excited to celebrate Daddy's victory, dancing, playing the tambourine, and happy just like my kids react when I come home from work every day. Well, Jephthah, however, remembers his vow and is distraught. As soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, "Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low, and you have become the cause of great trouble to me. For I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow." Oh, sure, it's her fault now. But Jephthah is trapped here, trapped by his hastily made and unnecessarily made vow. He had promised to offer up as a burnt offering whatever or whoever greeted him first. His daughter greeted him first. So now he would have to offer his own daughter up as a burnt offering. And his daughter knows it. She said to him, "My father, you have opened your mouth to the Lord. Do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, now that the Lord has avenged you on your enemies, on the Ammonites." I gotta think that most kids would react a little differently than that. What composure and faith this young girl displays. But she does have one condition. So she said to her father, "Let this thing be done to me. Leave me alone 2 months, that I may go up and down on the mountains and weep for my virginity, and I and my companions." You see, in those times, time well before women's rights and women in the workplace, a woman really had only one true purpose in life: to be a wife and a mother. And for this young girl, because of her father's idiotic vow, that purpose would be stolen from her. And so the story continues. So he said, "Go." And he sent her away for 2 months, and she departed, she and her companions, and wept for her virginity on the mountains. And at the end of 2 months she returned to her father, who did with her according to the vow that he had made. She had never known a man, and it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went year by year to lament the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite, 4 days in the year. You know, it's funny. You never see this story illustrated in children's Bibles. Actually, you rarely hear this story at all, and for good reason. I mean, it's terrible. It's a terrible story. It's one of those stories that you kind of wish never made it into the Bible. But here it is, and so we need to grapple with it. And it raises all sorts of questions for us. First, why does Jephthah keep such a terrible promise? Meaning he must have had something else in mind when he made this hasty vow. Maybe Fido the dog would come running out to greet him, or better yet, maybe the cat. That would be a double win. He just couldn't fathom that it would be his daughter that he would have to sacrifice, could he? But even then, when his only child comes rushing out, how could he follow through on that kind of a promise? I mean, could you do that? It probably depends on which kid, I suppose. Just kidding. But the second, and perhaps the more important question, is why would God want him to follow through on such a terrible promise? In fact, why would God honor such a vow in the first place? I mean, sure, in Genesis 22, he commands Abraham to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. But remember, he doesn't have him follow through on the sacrifice. He intervenes at the last second as a test of faith. God chose Jephthah as a judge to protect the Israelites against the Ammonites who were oppressing them. But the Bible never says that he approved of Jephthah's vow. And as we'll see with other judges, God uses them to deliver his people in spite of the foolish actions those judges make on their own. In Jephthah's case, in spite of this foolish and terrible vow. You know, there are some who struggle so much with these questions that they've put forth an alternative interpretation of this story. Knowing that God abhors human sacrifice, they have determined that instead of Jephthah offering his child up as a burnt sacrifice, he instead sacrificed his daughter into the service of God's house. Not unlike how Hannah vows to dedicate her son Samuel to serve the Lord. Well, I'd like to think that that's how this all ended up, but that's probably reading my own wishes into the story. In the end, we're left to grapple with the strength of promises in that time. It's a strange concept in our world of broken promises and thrown away vows. And yet, Jesus instructed on the Sermon on the Mount, let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. As for Jephthah, it seems he maybe never recovered from this terrible oath. It says he only judged Israel for 6 years, which is a pretty short period of time compared to the other judges. So be careful what you wish for, and be especially careful what you promise. It's tough stuff, and hopefully it makes for good conversation for you. So talk it over, and we'll see you in church.